It's time to take a new approach to finding true fulfillment in your career, health, and state of mind through insightful conversations with those who have found their professional and personal passions while achieving balance. Whether it's entrepreneurs, athletes, or healthcare professionals, we bring you real people, real growth right here on the Boost Podcast. Now, here's your host, Elena Lipson.
Hey Boost Squad, and welcome to episode 35. Elena Lipson here, and I am super excited to introduce today's featured guest, Courtney Kingston. Courtney, are you ready to join the Boost Squad?
I am, Elena.
So before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Mosaic Growth Partners. Mosaic Growth Partners provides growth strategy consulting to entrepreneurs and organizations in the healthcare and older adult baby boomer market. They can help you bring a new product or service to market, identify and engage new customers and partners, or grow your market share. They also provide coaching and training. For more information, go to mosaicgrowth.com. That's mosaicgrowth.com. Now back to today's featured guest.
So Courtney is the founder of Kingston Family Vineyards in Casablanca Valley, Chile. She's a graduate of Princeton University, and she started her career as a consultant for Deloitte's wine industry practice. There, she began learning the ins and outs of the California wine business. And later, as a student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, she wrote the vineyard's original business plan using the Chilean cattle ranch that her family had owned and operated since 1922. After many discussions about the feasibility of converting the family farm into a vineyard, Kingston Family Vineyards became a reality in 1998. Courtney and her husband Andy have 3 daughters and share their time between Portola Valley, California, and Chile's Casablanca Valley. So I am so excited to get into this with you, Courtney. I've never heard about the ins and outs of what it's really like to start and run your own vineyard. So why don't we just start off by having you tell us the 3 things that we should know about Kingston Family Vineyards?
Well, first of all, thank you, Elena. This is really fun for me. I really appreciate your interest in what my family's been doing and what I've been doing for the last 20 odd years. Well, the first thing to know is that my family is bicultural and binational. So people often say, Kingston, Los Kingstons, ¿quién son los Kingstons? What's the story there? We make handcrafted, organically farmed wines on this vineyard, on this farm that's been in our family now for 5 generations. And we are fortunate enough to today, in the last 5 years, we've been hosting guests who visit us there, and we just share more about our story, how we ended up in Casablanca, how we make the wines that we do, and what our commitment and stewardship is of this land that's been with us for almost 100 years.
Wow. So how did you get into this business? I know that you mentioned you were a consultant for Deloitte's wine industry practice, which was kind of shocking to me because I worked at Deloitte for 7 years and I had never heard of that. And so that just kind of proves that sometimes you can end up in these standard corporate jobs that, you think you're kind of just pushing paper, and you can stumble upon something that can actually shape your entire career in a really interesting way. And it sounds like that's what your experience at Deloitte did. So I'd love to hear more about that and how it brought you to where you are today.
Sure. So I moved out to the West Coast in the early 90s, and I was with Deloitte in their San Francisco practice. And they were just starting up trying to grow their practice in wine. And I was the business analyst on the job, which meant that I was the data grunt, the most junior person. And in that time, in those projects, I learned a lot about the ins and outs and the ups and downs of wine. It was at the same time in the mid-90s that the first grapevines were being planted in our family's valley in Chile, where my dad grew up on a farm. It was also the same time as my generation was now in their 20s that we were starting to think about what was next for the farm. What could we contribute? What could we do to try to keep this farm going for another 3 or 4 generations and hopefully more? So that's when it started. We started doing a bunch of research and learning, and it took years and years of study. When you've been somewhere for so long, the good news is you're in no rush. you can take a long-term perspective. So we took a while to study, and I was at Stanford Business School when I got a little deeper into writing the business case to plant top quality Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the hills of our farm.
Great. And at what point did you kind of know in the back of your mind that you really wanted to grow this into like your full-time business and make this a reality versus it just being kind of like a side project that you did in between when you weren't working at your other full-time job or in school?
Yeah. Well, I was really happy in San Francisco. I mean, I moved out to the Bay Area for 1 year. I thought it was a year off. I had some classmates in college who were going to go to Asia for a year or go wherever they were fortunate enough to go to try to have a really meaningful experience. And then they were going to get serious. And I've now been in the Bay Area for 25 years. And my job before and after business school, both times, whether it was in consulting or after in tech, I was surrounded by like-minded people. It was fast. I couldn't believe I was paid to do what I did. And so very much my time that I was spending on trying to help the farm was an extracurricular weekend kind of thing. I was also, after business school, I was a single woman in my 30s. And I knew pretty clearly, given my frequent trips to Chile, that the dynamic would be the freedom that I had as a single woman in my 30s in leadership roles in business in the States, in San Francisco, was quite different than rural Chile.
Yep.
So this was not something I was going to jump into full hog early on.
And what was the turning point for you when you decided to really put all your eggs into that basket and make this a full-time pursuit?
I turned 30, and I remember a friend saying, you know what, pretty much anything you do before 30, you can excuse. But I turned 30 and my job had changed. I had gone from being an individual contributor to really a manager and a leader. And that was pretty heady stuff. I had a big team. I had big responsibility in terms of revenues and operations, but I was burning out. The I can't believe I'm paid to do this job transition to things went flat for me. I wasn't excited about my job anymore. I had gone from being the yes, we can do anything to realizing that I was the one sitting around the table when some people would have a brainstorming session. I was the no person. I'd become the no person, and well, I don't know. Maybe there are people that want to be the no people. It wasn't me, and I lost my energy. I lost my sparkle. I wasn't happy. And I knew I needed to make a change. So in the beginning, it was incremental. In the beginning, it was sabbatical, un sabbatical, as we would say in Chile. It was just I took a year off was what I was doing. And I kept all my irons in the fire in tech. But meanwhile, I moved into a closet in my flat apartment. That was my office in San Francisco. And I tried to start something from scratch.
Very cool. I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. I think the two times when, right before I left different companies, I felt the same way as you did. I was burned out and I found myself becoming really negative. And that's not how I wanted to be either. I like to be, open to new ideas and figuring out how we can make things work. And I think what you brought up is a really good indicator of, when it might be time to leave your current situation is when you start feeling that negativity, when you start feeling burnt out, when you become that no person. So that's a great point that you brought up there. I want to learn a little bit more from you and get your perspective on where you think the wine business is today and where it's headed, including the aspect of running a vineyard in that context.
Sure. Gosh, it's been changing in so many exciting and daunting ways on both ends of the spectrum. The great news is that more and more people around the world are enjoying wine. Wine used to be this thing where it was full of pretense and full of us versus them, full of everybody else must know what they're talking about, but I have no clue what I'm talking about kind of thing. That you'd be nervous when you got handed the wine list, especially at a business dinner. And, oh my gosh, what are you supposed to bring? What bottle are you supposed to bring to your boss's house? Just lots of weight around wine. And that has changed, which is really great. I don't know whether we thank $2 Chuck for that, whether we thank just people being more and more curious and interested in wine as a connector, as a storyteller, as a way of traveling the world. So I would say that's the biggest change. And with that, more and more people are seeking wines that speak of a place, that tell a story. And through that, as they are drinking and enjoying that wine, that they can make their own stories. I mean, wines are, the Last Supper. They're all about bringing people together in community, like sharing bread, like sharing a meal. And that can be sacred. I feel very fortunate to be a part of that world.
Yeah, you brought up something I actually wanted to ask you about. What are your thoughts on things like two-buck chuck and like boxed wine? Do you think they kind of like cheapen the experience, or are you a fan of them for getting more people interested in wine?
Well, I have to tell you that my first bottle of wine I ever bought, I was 21 and I only bought it because it was cheaper than a 6-pack of Henry Weinhard's, which is a long gone brand, I think, in San Francisco. No, I think two-buck chuck and the like is great, yellowtail and the like, because people start drinking wine. And I think if their experience is similar to my experience, I didn't grow up drinking first growth Bordeaux. I grew up, again, drinking wine because I moved to an area where it was plentiful and affordable. And then with that, I started thinking, I remember the first time I tasted a wine I didn't like, and I was so thrilled that I actually had a discriminating palate.
I know that does take time to develop.
So, no, I think that is great, because I think the more entry points for people to discover and enjoy wine, the better.
Yeah, and I think that's something that translates to a lot of type of goods. So if you're out there thinking about starting a new business, you could also think about what's like the gateway product to get people interested in this type of good. And, for a lot of people, especially younger people who don't have a lot of money, two-buck chuck is what got them into wine. And so, you could be the next two-buck chuck in your industry. Just some food for thought there.
That's exactly true.
Yep. So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to hear a little bit about how you've grown your business from when you started working on it inside your closet and to how it's grown today. Can you give us some tactics for how you've done that?
Sure. Well, there I was in my closet, 30-year-old, definitely wanted to stay living in the Bay Area and travel to Chile, but I didn't have any plans to move in the near term. And I'd say my first tip would be to use what you have. And, a lot of times I think we look at our neighbors and we think, well, they got a lot more than I do. What do I have? I don't have anything. And in fact, if you think about it, there are things that we do have. And so there I was, how can I help the farm? What can I do when I have these other choices I've made? Like, I've made the decision that I'm not going to live there full time at this point in my life. How can I help? And so what I ended up doing was, in my case, I used my contacts, the fact that my family was Chilean American, to help take a very different focus to making wine in Casablanca. So that was a big, big change. And so to be more specific, I focused on the direct-to-consumer model. I focused on, what if we built relationships directly with individuals who tasted our wines, who came and visited us in Casablanca, and then we could ship to their homes in the U.S. when they got back, where we were legally able, which is not Utah, by the way. But that was a key thing. So using what you have. And by the way, sometimes you might not recognize that right away. I mean, my uncle, when we talked about planting a grapevine, my uncle said, that frostbitten dust bowl, because that's what it was when he was growing up, and things had changed. Another idea is keep showing up. When I transitioned to wine out of tech, I had a network of 3 people. And I remember making a conscious note about when I contacted them, so I didn't contact them too much. So I had to space it out. But I did keep showing up, and I made a point that I would have something in return where I could help them. So I think that timing is everything. And now that I've been, in this industry for 15, 20 years, it means a lot for me to realize that I just kept showing up. And I've noticed that, by the way, also in hiring key team members. We're a small team, both in Chile and in the US. And I've had a couple times where I didn't have an opening that fit with somebody's talents. And they just kept reappearing. They kept updating me on what they were doing in their career. They understood there wasn't a near-term fit. And then they would just sort of gently update me on their trajectory. And when the time was right, we were fortunate enough to bring Blair onto our team. Another idea is say thank you. We are only able to do what we do thanks to the guests that take the time to come find us at the end of a dirt road. And we are really grateful for that. And I find that in our world today, which can feel increasingly disconnected for a variety of reasons, building a personal connection means everything. So, because we're small, there's using what you have, I write handwritten notes to every new member of our Old Corral Club. These are members that join our club, and then we ship our wines to them twice a year. So they get our newest wines that often sell out before they make it to a restaurant or a wine shop. So I write them a note and tell them what the weather's like on the farm this week, since maybe they haven't been there for 6 months, and reconnect them back to our story and their own story that they made when they came to see us.
Those are some great tips. And I can actually say that personalization and the direct-to-consumer model is actually how Courtney and I met. So my parents were on a trip to Chile recently and visited her vineyard, had such a lovely time, formed a personal connection with her team there, and mentioned that I have this podcast. And so that's how we got connected, because Courtney is a perfect example of the type of entrepreneurs that we like to have on the show. So there really is that personal touch there. I'm curious though, Courtney, is that still your primary business model, or have you branched out into some B2B business as well?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, it's gone the opposite way, Elena. When we first started, we had no reputation. So when we first started, we were focused 100% on making the best possible wine, world-class wines that we could make from our farm. And in fact, when we first started, we were just focused on growing the grapes. Our plan was not to make any wine. I had read too many business school cases at Stanford, and knowing that the way you make a small fortune in the wine business is starting with a large one. And I was determined to not bet the farm literally on that. So we were focused on the farming side of basically boutique grape growing, and realized when we had our first harvest and we're selling our grapes that felt like our children for the first time, and a ton of our Pinot Noir sold for half the price a ton of our Sauvignon Blanc, that something was wrong in the model. And what had happened was that we had Pinot Noir is now quite well known, whether it was the movie Sideways or in Chile it was Entre Copas. But at the time it was very niche and not well known at all. And so I knew we were ahead of the market in planting Pinot, but we were so ahead of the market there was none. So when we first started, our wines were sold almost entirely, as you say, to be through we would call the wholesale channel. I did import them up into the US myself, and then worked with distributors from there, because I don't think an importer would have even picked us up. We were too niche. Our wines were $30 a bottle, which was in 2000, that was a very expensive bottle of wine for Chile. And even today, we still are working to build Chile's reputation. Chile's done such a great job of being perceived as a great value wine, but with that value connotation can be loaded sometimes, and sometimes it can be harder for people to realize that value can also mean an excellent $30 bottle of wine. So when we first started, my number one thing was actually to convince top sommeliers in the US, in New York, and San Francisco, who were really gatekeepers to the industry and key press that our wines were worth tasting. And that evolved into connecting us. It's true in many businesses. When you get your first customer, your first big important customer, you then can leverage that. And people say, oh, wow, Raj Par, Bernie's son, they liked your wines? Oh, well, then I'd love to try it. And that really helped us pick up distributors in different markets. And we really did not turn, while I had set the infrastructure up very early on in terms of the licensing to sell direct to consumer, we did not start hosting guests until, I guess we had been written up in the Wine Spectator and a couple other magazines, and been fortunate enough to receive some nice ratings and be on some nice wine lists. When my dad were at the Casa Patronal, which is our family's old house on the farm that was built in the late 1800s, Dad said, there's someone in the garden. Do you know them? And we didn't. They were just some very committed enophiles who had read about our wines and then tasted them, and then were on a trip to Chile and found us. And so it was that got our wheels turning, realizing that more and more people were coming to Chile, whether it was to go to Patagonia and go see the glaciers before there's more change there, or go to Atacama, the desert up in the north of the Lake District. And because of our location, only an hour outside of Santiago in wine country, we are a convenient stop to and from. So that was really our number one transition to hosting people, was probably in the last 5 years only.
Okay. That's interesting. So, it sounds like you tried a couple of different things along the way, and it must have been hard being kind of a brand that no one had heard of and then trying to go out into the market. So can you tell us about a time when you stagnated or you faced a lot of challenges, and then how you kind of got back on track to moving forward after that?
Well, I have so many times, Elena. Just one? I love it how people today, we like to use the word pivot.
Yep.
Well, we've had to pivot or course correct many, many times. As one, your assumptions you realize are off, or two, things change all around you. I'll tell you actually about a very personal time. In 2004, my family, Andy and our 3 daughters, we moved to Chile. And we did that for a couple reasons. One, Andy is an entrepreneur as well, but in tech. We were both at Stanford in grad school, although we didn't overlap, and we met in San Francisco later. He was between companies and exhausted, and he needed a complete change. He needed to completely discharge his batteries before he could recharge them. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we were trying to figure out how to create, in Chile, there's a term called lazo, which is basically what it sounds like, a lasso. How could we create the lasso for the next generation, for our kids? And we decided it was to the farm, And we decided it was to move to Chile and live there for a year, which on the surface sounds super glamorous and super easy. And of course we had family there, and this must be so, just sort of plop right in. Well, we didn't take the easy way. Part of it was my probably stubborn independence. I really wanted to do it my own way. I really wanted to not need to rely on family members and figure it out on our own. So we lived in Santiago because we thought if we lived in Casablanca that we'd just talk to ourselves, and this was meant to be immersion. At that point, I was very much a country girl. The only time I went into the capital was to meet with the lawyers, the banks, or the graphic designers for our business. And that was it. And so we lived in the center of Santiago. And a long way of telling you that, and we put our kids in school with my Chilean cousin Isabel's daughters. So full immersion for our kids. They were 4, 6, and 8 at the time. My husband's Spanish, while he spent junior year abroad in Oaxaca, was pretty much non-existent, as he was from Dayton, Ohio. And I also did not backfill my role on the importing, sales, and marketing side in the U.S., and then took on a general manager role at the winery. So I took on more than I could without realizing it. Because at other points in my life, I was a cross country runner. It was always sort of mind over matter, just sort of push through. But this was clearly not a sprint. And I lost track of the importance of putting my oxygen mask on first. And I also lost track of the things that really refueled me. I mean, I had my family and kids there. And of course, my family and kids give me enormous amount of, support, energy, and love. But I needed more than that. And I needed the laughter and empathy of my closest friends. I needed this is silly, but I needed my vegetable box that came every week from my CSA and I needed, all sorts of things that I had built into my routine that gave me strength and gave me respite. I mean, I remember us I'd watch Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, and Andy and I going to watch it in Santiago, late at night on our bed, and just because the laughter helped. And it would come up, and for copyright reasons, we couldn't watch it. And I remember Jon Stewart it taped it clearly, and he said, you are so close and yet so far away. So I actually fell into a pretty severe depression, Elena. I had a really hard year. I hit burnout, and I confronted pretty significant failure. What had been my love that I had built over the past 15 years, this Chilean winery, was now felt to me to be a burden, a rock, and drawing me to the bottom of the lake. It was extremely, extremely painful. And my mind over matter wasn't working for me. And my brain, which had always been you never are supposed to play on your looks. Well, I couldn't, and I didn't. So I always played on my brain. Well, even that wasn't working. And it was really hard. So that was a really, really inflection point and a time of humility and learning for me in my life.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. Really appreciate how open and transparent you were with that story. One of the things I'm curious about is, now having gone through that, what do you do to kind of prevent that from happening and to make sure you're taking care of yourself?
Good question. So one of the things, my mom always jokes that Courtney thinks there are 90 minutes in every hour. So I'm trying to not do that anymore. So I used to look at my day or week ahead, and I would look at the spaces and fill them up. And now I look at the spaces and I try to respect them. So I actually try to honor the space and the downtime in my life and in my days, which you can imagine they're still pretty full with 3 daughters and an entrepreneurial husband and a business that is 6,000 miles away. Challenging, but that really helps me. I also try to remind myself that I'm not in charge. One of the great things we were able to do when we were in Chile was travel. We traveled up and down. We made sure we stayed in Chile the whole time because we wanted to go to every corner. And Chile's as long as the U.S. is wide. And so incredibly geographically diverse and fascinating. But it is hard to go to Patagonia, to all the way down to the southern tip of Chile, where Shackleton left for his voyage in Antarctica, where the glaciers are still there, and not be small and not be reminded of some greater power in your life, whatever that is for you. And so that helps me. That really helps me listen through the noise in life and gives me energy.
Yeah, that's great. So you've given us a lot of great insights into how you built your business, how you have a tendency to overpack your schedule and can take on too much, but you seem to know how to control that. And you've had a lot of different life experiences that have led you to where you are today. But let's go ahead and part with a parting piece of guidance for the rest of us.
I guess I would say is that the hardest thing about pursuing a dream is that it's not convenient. Sometimes it's a lot easier to have your dream up there on a shelf, like with a little bow on top, and it's, there's my dream, and it sits above your desk, and you don't ever open it because what if it's not what you thought it was? What if you failed? And I would say take it down and give it a try. My daughters are obsessed with Hamilton. They haven't been able to see it as few, right? It's so hard to get a ticket, much less afford one. But one of their favorite songs is, I'm not giving away my shot. Don't give away your shot. Take down that box, open it up, give it a shot.
Yeah, absolutely. So give it a shot. Don't let fear prevent you from going after your dream. I hope today's episode has inspired you to think more about how you can find your passion and live your best life. For more information, including links to resources that Courtney and I chatted about today and how best to get in touch with her, head on over to our website, theboostpodcast.com, and check out our show notes from this episode and catch the Boost bonus. Courtney, I want to thank you for sharing your journey with us today. And remember, anything is possible for you.
Now that you've completed this episode, the next step is to join the Boost Squad for strategic insights, tips, and tricks, as well as exclusive resources designed specifically to accelerate your personal and professional growth. All this and more is waiting for you at mosaicgrowth.com.